I told my daughter I had 6 months to live on a Thursday evening in October. Not with tears, not with my voice breaking, not with any of the theater a weaker man might have reached for. I told her, the way you tell someone a fact that's already settled and dry inside you, sitting across the dinner table, my hands flat on the wood, the porch light throwing long shadows through the window behind her. I said, Rachel, I went to see Dr. Fenwick on Monday. It's the pancreas. He's giving me 6 months. Maybe 8 if I'm stubborn about it. I watched her face. And my daughter, my 41-year-old daughter who I'd raised in that house, who'd learned to swim in the lake behind it, who'd sat across this same table every Sunday since she was old enough to hold a fork, said 4 words before she could stop herself. She said, "So it's finally happening." And then she caught it. She rearranged her face into something that looked like grief. She said she meant the diagnosis, that she'd known something was wrong for months, that she was in shock, that of course she'd be there for me. She talked for almost 5 minutes in the careful register of a woman walking back a sentence that had already landed on the floor between us. But I'd heard it. 4 words, clean and unguarded, the sound of somebody who'd been waiting on something and had just been told it was arriving, finally happening. I didn't have 6 months. I didn't have cancer. Dr. Fenwick and I had gone to high school together, and he'd done me a favor that violated at least 3 professional ethics guidelines, and I owed him a fishing trip for it. I'd been testing her, and she had just failed it in the most specific way a test can be failed, which is when the truth comes out of your mouth before you've had time to decide whether you're the kind of person who'd say it. What I found in her car, 3 days later, was worse than finally. Worse by a margin I'm still working out the math on. If you're watching this, drop where you're tuning in from down in the comments, hit that like button, and let me walk you through it from the beginning. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 67 years old and I live outside Bozeman, Montana, on 11 acres. My father bought in 1962 for less money than a used truck costs now. I built a log home construction business out of that land, Kessler Timber and Frame, starting with 1 crew and a bank loan my wife co-signed against her own mother's advice. 31 years later, it was 14 crews, contracts across 3 counties, and a name that meant something to people who cared about how a house was actually put together instead of how fast it went up. My wife Dorothy died 5 years ago. Aneurysm, no warning, gone between one Tuesday and the next. She used to keep the books and keep me honest in roughly equal measure, and losing both of those things at once left a hole in the operation I never fully patched, which is part of why I sold the business 2 years after she passed, to a company out of Denver that wanted the crews more than they wanted my name on the letterhead. I'm going to tell you what they paid. It matters later. Rachel is my older child, 41, lives in Livingston, 40 minutes from the ranch, works as a wealth manager at a regional firm that handles a lot of retirement accounts for people who built things with their hands and don't fully trust banks, but trust Rachel because she's their neighbor's daughter and she remembers their grandkids' names. It's a job that rewards a certain kind of person, someone who's good at knowing what a thing is worth before the person holding it does. Rachel is sharp and she's warm in the specific way that makes people hand her their life savings without asking many follow-up questions. And she has her mother's laugh, which I mention because that laugh has made it harder for me to see her clearly for longer than it should have. My younger son, Marcus, is 36. He lives in Missoula, 2.5 hours west, works as a large animal veterinarian, mostly cattle and horses on ranches scattered across 3 counties, which means he's up at 4 most mornings, and still finds time to call me every Sunday night at 7 sharp, a habit he's kept for 5 years without missing one. Except for the night his wife went into labor early, and he called anyway, from the hallway outside the delivery room, to apologize for the fact that the call might be short. Marcus is the kind of man who apologizes for the timing of the best news of his life, which tells you close to everything you need to know about him. Marcus didn't know about the test. Nobody knew about the test except me and Dr. Fenwick. And Fenwick only knew the part where I needed a diagnosis on official-looking letterhead that would hold up under a raised eyebrow. Not my accountant, not my lawyer, not my hunting buddy Gene, who I've known since 1988 and who I did eventually tell, but only after everything had already played out. The test was mine alone. I built slow over a few weeks in late summer, because something had been collecting in me long enough that I needed to know if what I suspected was true before I did anything about it. What I'd suspected started small, the way these things do. A remark Rachel made about the ranch at Thanksgiving, about how 11 acres was a lot of upkeep for one man alone. A question, phrased casually over pie, about how the sale of the timber business had been structured, whether it came in one lump or spread across years for tax reasons. A conversation with Marcus, mentioned in passing on one of our Sunday calls, where he said Rachel had phoned him out of nowhere to ask how I'd been doing financially since Mom. Marcus hadn't found it strange. Marcus doesn't find much that Rachel does strange, because Marcus has spent his whole life extending her the kind of benefit of the doubt that younger siblings extend older ones, a credit line Rachel had been drawing against for 2 decades, without ever making a payment on it. I found it strange. I found the accumulation of small financial curiosities strange, in the specific way a man who built something out of raw timber and a bank loan learns to find patterns, strange, meaning I noticed the shape of it before I had a name for the shape. And once I had the name, I couldn't put it back down. So I built the test. I asked Fenwick for the letter. I spent 2 weeks getting my own story straight in my head, the kind of details a dying man would actually know, so that when I sat down across from Rachel, I'd be consistent enough to be believed. I called her on a Tuesday and asked if she'd come out to the ranch for dinner Thursday, just the 2 of us, since Marcus was 3 hours off delivering a calf somewhere outside Roundup. She said of course, and she showed up early, which Rachel always did when she suspected something might be happening that she wanted to be first to hear. We ate. We cleared the plates. We sat with coffee the way we'd been sitting with coffee on that porch since she was tall enough to reach the table. And then I told her, pancreas, 6 months, maybe 8, finally happening. 4 words, unguarded, true in the only way that mattered, which was that they told me exactly what she'd been sitting on. The 5 minutes of recovery after it were almost more revealing than the words themselves, because I could watch the machinery working behind her eyes, the recalculation of what I'd just heard come out of her, the effort of folding it back into something that looked like a daughter's grief instead of what it actually was. I've spent 31 years reading crews and contractors and men who tell you a job's half done when it's a third done, and Rachel was working fast, but not fast enough, not for somebody who'd watched her do arithmetic behind her face since she was 9 years old cheating at gin rummy. We talked another hour after that. She was gentle and useful, and said all the things a daughter should say when her father hands her something like that across a table. She said she wanted to come with me to the next appointment. She said we shouldn't make any decisions about the ranch too quickly. She said she had a colleague who specialized in end-of-life financial planning who could walk us through options if we needed them. She said us. She said we. I told her I loved her for it. I walked her to her car. I stood on the porch after her taillights disappeared down the gravel, and then I went inside and sat in the dark for a long while before I went to bed. I want you to sit with the space between that Thursday and the following Sunday, because that space is where this story stopped being about one 4-word slip and turned into something I hadn't braced myself for, even after finally. I'd thought the test ended at the dinner table. I'd thought what I needed to know was whether the truth would surface when the news landed, whether the performance would crack long enough to show me what was underneath it. And it had, and I'd seen it, and I believed that was the whole shape of what I was dealing with. I was wrong about the shape. Sunday morning showed me the rest of it. If you're still with me, drop a comment, hit that like button, because what I found in Rachel's car that morning is the reason this story doesn't end at 4 words over pie. Rachel had asked to borrow my truck that Saturday. Hers was in the shop, mine sits idle most weekends anyway, and she'd left her own car parked in my drive overnight, said she'd swing by Sunday after church to trade back. I'm an early riser, always have been, 31 years of 5 a.m., crew calls doesn't leave a man's body when the business does. I was up at 5:40 that Sunday, coffee in hand, walking the porch the way I do most mornings, checking on nothing in particular, and Rachel's car was sitting there with the window cracked 2 inches, the way she always leaves it because she can't stand a stuffy interior. On the passenger seat, in plain sight, not hidden, not locked away, was a manila folder with my name on the tab in her handwriting. Walter Estate. I want to be honest with you. I told myself I wasn't going to open it. I stood there for a full minute telling myself that. Then I opened it. Inside was a printed appraisal, dated 3 weeks earlier, 3 weeks before I'd even told her the diagnosis, valuing the ranch and the timber rights at $2.1 million, done by an appraiser I'd never heard of and never hired. Behind it was a draft, unsigned, of what looked like a durable power of attorney, my name typed in, Rachel's name in the box marked agent, a second box for successor agent left conspicuously blank, where Marcus's name should have gone, if anyone had been thinking about Marcus at all. And behind that, held together with a paperclip, was a printout of an email thread between Rachel and a man named Terrence Whitlock, whose signature line identified him as a broker, specializing in rural land acquisitions. The most recent message, sent 2 days before our dinner, read, in part, that once things were formalized, Whitlock's group could move fast on the acreage, that the timber rights alone were worth pursuing separately from the house, and that Terrence looked forward to Rachel getting the paperwork in order on her end. I stood in my own driveway in my socks with my daughter's file open in my hands, and I felt something in the center of my chest go very still, the way things go still when a thing you'd suspected turns solid and gets edges and a weight to it. She hadn't waited for a diagnosis to start moving. She'd had the appraisal done first. She'd built the paperwork first. My getting sick, or her believing I was getting sick, wasn't the beginning of anything. It was the excuse she'd been waiting to use. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, angled the same way against the seat, and I went back inside. And when Rachel came by at 10 to trade cars, I handed her the keys and told her I loved her and thanked her for coming out. I did not say a word about the folder. I walked her to her car. And then, once she was gone down the gravel road, I called Marcus. He picked up on the first ring, which surprised me, since it wasn't our night. He said, "Dad, is everything okay?" I told him everything, the diagnosis that wasn't real, the dinner, the 4 words, and what I'd found in the passenger seat of his sister's car that morning. Marcus went quiet for a long stretch, the particular quiet of a man rearranging 20 years of memory around one new fact he didn't want to be true. "She asked me last month," he said finally, "if I thought you should maybe have somebody helping you manage things out at the ranch. She said you'd been forgetting things." I asked him, "What things?" He said he hadn't been able to think of any at the time, and he still couldn't. Rachel had been laying groundwork with him too, the same way she'd been laying it with me. 2 separate stories running in parallel, calibrated so that when the moment came, neither of us would think to compare notes before the ink dried. "What do you need from me?" Marcus said. I told him I needed the name of a good estate attorney, somebody sharp, somebody in Bozeman who wouldn't blink at moving fast. He had one before I finished asking, a woman named Colette Ashby, who'd handled a dispute for a rancher friend of his 2 counties over. Of course he did. Marcus is the kind of man who has the number you're going to need before you know you need it, not because he's calculating, but because he pays attention to the world in a way that costs him nothing and saves other people everything. I called Colette Ashby that same afternoon. She listened, without interrupting, the whole account, twice through when I circled back on details. And when I finished, she said, "Mr. Kessler, I need to ask you one thing before we go any further. Do you have documentation of the actual sale of your business, the real figures?" I told her I had the complete closing paperwork and 31 years of books kept by an accountant who'd never once had to correct my numbers for me. "Good," she said. "And this folder in the car, did you photograph it before you put it back?" I hadn't thought to. She was quiet a moment. "All right. The diagnosis conversation, the appraisal dated before you told her anything, the draft power of attorney, and the broker correspondence together, that paints a very clear picture, even without photographs. What I want to do is build a complete, accurate, notarized record of your actual financial position, in writing, so there's no version of this where the real numbers can be argued with later. And I want to revise your estate documents before Rachel takes another step, because based on what you've described, she's already moving on a schedule." "How soon can I come in?" I said. "Tomorrow, 7:30, she said. I was there at 7:15. Colette Ashby in person was exactly what her voice on the phone had promised. Unhurried, exact, the specific calm of somebody who has walked this particular road with other families enough times to know where every turn goes without needing to speed up for any of them. She had a legal pad and she wrote in small, even handwriting that covered the page without wasting any of it. I told her everything again in order, and when I was done, she turned to a second page and started a list of what she'd need. My accountant's full picture, the business sale documents, my current will, a signed, dated account of the Thursday dinner and the Sunday morning discovery, as close to word for word as I could manage. How much weight does a written account carry without the photographs? I asked her. Combined with everything else, considerable, she said. You're not filing anything against your daughter, Mr. Kessler, not yet. You're documenting your actual position and revising your estate to reflect your actual intentions. The written account is supporting material. The foundation is the numbers. The numbers, when Colette pulled them together with my accountant by that afternoon, were substantial. The sale of Kessler Timber and Frame had closed for $3.2 million, most of it up front, the remainder in a 3-year earnout, 2 years of which had already paid out. The ranch itself, per an independent appraisal Colette commissioned that same week, valued at $2.4 million, $300,000 above the figure sitting in Rachel's folder, which meant she and her broker knew the property was worth more than what they'd priced it at for whoever they were planning to route it through, or knew exactly what it was worth, and were planning to keep the difference quiet on both ends. Add in retirement accounts and 30 years of conservative investing, and the total came to just over $6 million, held by a man his daughter believed was dying, broke, or dying, and about to need someone else's signature on everything he owned. I want you to sit with that gap for a second, same as I had to. A power of attorney drafted before a diagnosis existed. A land broker on standby. A brother's name left off the paperwork entirely, like an afterthought that never made it to the page. Colette revised my estate over the following 4 days, and I want to tell you plainly what changed and what didn't, because both halves matter to me. What didn't change? Marcus's position. He'd earned his share honestly across 36 years, and nothing I'd learned in the last week altered a single fact of that. What changed? Rachel's position, not erased, but restructured to something specific and documented, accounting for what I'd already given her across her adult life: tuition, a down payment on her first condo, 2 loans that had quietly stopped being loans somewhere along the way and were never once mentioned again by her, and support that had never once been acknowledged as support. She'd get something. She would not get what she'd built, a folder to take. The ranch itself went into a trust, with Colette as independent trustee, no sale possible without her written approval, and a fresh independent appraisal, no family member permitted to serve as buyer, broker, or agent on any transaction touching the land. Marcus was named co-trustee. I called him the evening the documents were signed, and told him. He was quiet, then he said, "Dad, you didn't have to do all that." "I know," I said. "That's why it matters." The documents were signed, notarized, and filed on a Friday, 11 days after I'd told my daughter I was dying, and she'd told me, in 4 words, that she'd been waiting for it. On Saturday morning, I called Rachel. If you're still watching, drop a comment and tell me what you'd have said in that call, because how I finally said it to her is the part of this whole thing I spent the longest getting right. Rachel answered on the first ring. She'd been answering on the first ring all week, which told me she was watching her phone closer than she usually bothered to. "Dad," she said, warm and immediate, "how are you feeling? I've been thinking about you every day." "I'm feeling fine," I said. "I wanted to talk through some things. Can you come by this afternoon?" "Of course," she said. "Absolutely, whatever you need," I said. 3 o'clock. She was there at 2:50. She came in wearing the same careful gentleness she'd been wearing all week. The practiced warmth of somebody managing a situation she believes is moving in her direction. She sat at the kitchen table. I set coffee in front of her. I sat across from her, and I said, "Rachel, I want to tell you something true before I tell you the rest of it. I love you. That doesn't change no matter what I say next, and I want you to have that first, so everything after it lands the right way." She looked at me. Something small moved across her face, the first flicker of understanding that this wasn't the conversation she'd walked in expecting. "I'm not sick," I said. "There's no diagnosis. Fenwick did me a favor, and I'm going to owe him for it the rest of my life. I told you I was dying because I needed to know something, and you told me before you had time to decide whether you were the kind of person who'd say it out loud. 4 words. Rachel. And they told me everything." Silence. She set her hands flat on the table, She didn't say anything. And Sunday morning, I said, when your car sat in my driveway with the window cracked, the folder was sitting right there on the seat. Walter, estate, in your handwriting. The appraisal from 3 weeks before I ever said a word to you. The power of attorney with your name in the box, and Marcus's name missing from it entirely. Terrence Whitlock's emails about moving fast once things were formalized. Rachel's face went the particular pale of somebody rapidly reconstructing a recent history and finding out the reconstruction doesn't hold. She started to talk, the same careful register from Thursday night, that it wasn't what it looked like, that she'd been trying to protect the ranch from probate delays, that Terrence was just an old contact she'd reached out to for a general sense of the market. Nothing formal, nothing decided. I let her get most of the way through it before I said, Rachel, the appraisal is dated. Whitlock's email says formalized. I built a fictional cancer diagnosis to see what was already sitting in motion before I ever lit the fuse, and it turns out the fuse was lit weeks before I struck the match. She stopped talking. I'm not disowning you, I said, because I could see that fear land in her eyes before I even finished the sentence. The specific fear of somebody watching a door they assumed would always stay open, start to swing shut. You're still my daughter, and you'll still inherit something. Because I raised you and I loved your mother, and some part of that math doesn't change no matter what you did in a driveway with a stranger's phone number. But the ranch is in a trust now. Marcus is co-trustee. Nobody sells that land without an independent appraisal and Colette Ashby's signature. And that includes you, and that includes anyone you know who buys and flips rural acreage for a living. She cried, and I believe some of it was real, the way grief and getting caught can look nearly identical from across a kitchen table if you're not paying close attention. And I've spent 31 years paying close attention. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know how it had gotten as far as it had. She said she'd talked to Marcus herself, that she owed him that conversation more than she owed it to me. I told her I hoped she would. I told her the door out of this wasn't closed, that trust gets rebuilt the slow way, the only way it's ever built the first time, through years of actions that match the words, instead of years of words that get ahead of the actions. I told her I still wanted her at Sunday dinner. I told her Marcus still called me every week at 7, and that some Sundays, if she wanted, she could be there too, and we'd figure out the rest of it the way families are supposed to. Slowly, with the truth sitting in the middle of the table, instead of a folder sitting on a car seat. She left around 5. I watched her taillights go down the gravel, same as I had the Thursday before, and this time I stood on the porch a long while afterward, not because I was waiting to hear anything through a window, but because I wanted to feel, all the way through, what it costs a man to find out the shape of his own child, and to choose, even after seeing it clearly, not to burn the whole thing down over it. Marcus came out that Sunday, same as always, 7 o'clock, except this time in person instead of on the phone, and we sat on the porch and he asked me, careful, whether I thought Rachel would ever really understand what she'd nearly done. I told him I didn't know. I told him, understanding wasn't something you could build into a trust document, and that all I could control was the paperwork and the truth, and everything past that belonged to her. I'm not going to tell you this ends with some perfect Hallmark reunion, because it doesn't, not yet, and maybe not ever completely. What I'll tell you is that 6 weeks later, Rachel called Marcus herself, on a Tuesday, out of nowhere, and apologized to him directly for the missing box on that draft, for the 2 separate stories she'd been running, for treating his trust like something she didn't need to spend effort maintaining because she'd always had it for free. Marcus told me it was the first time in years she'd apologized for something without immediately explaining why it wasn't really her fault. That's not everything, but it's something. And at 67, with a folder full of paperwork I never wanted to need, and a piece of land my father bought with money he didn't have to spare, I've learned that something honest is worth more than a lot of things that only look finished. If you made it this far, tell me down in the comments what you would have done differently. Whether you'd have handed her that inheritance back whole or cut it clean, the way some of you are probably already typing out right now. I read every one of them. And if this is the kind of story you needed tonight, hit that like button, and I'll see you in the next one.